What the hell is that?
Lauren,
Who is this?
that's on a need-to-know basis. And right now, you do not need to know who I am. Your mission!
My mission? Is this some kind of...
Your mission is to infiltrate the Furidashi podcast, free the hostage co-host, and stop his destructive obsession with Hideo Kojima.
I don't need to infiltrate the podcast. I'm already a
You
host.
need to take this seriously! If your friend continues on this path and becomes lost in the year of Metal Gear, all hope will be lost. For your friend, and for humanity as well.
But what if I get lost too?
Remember, you cannot let him know about your mission. If you want him to survive, he needs to believe nothing is amiss, that everything's okay, that the world isn't going to burn.
What? Nicholas? Nicholas? Where are you?
Welcome, everybody, to this Season 6 of the Furidashi podcast, what we are calling the Year of Metal Gear. I am Nicholas, as always, and I am here with the inimitable Lauren Ash.
Inimitable is an amazing adjective for me, and I'm already feeling that this year is going to be a great one. Yeah, everyone, we're here with the year of Hideo Kojima. It's the year of Metal Gear, and it might even be a year plus one.
Yeah, a year and change.
A year and some change, just like Metal Gear. I think for me, I'm super excited to really not only dive into the world of Metal Gear Solid, and as well as the world of Death Stranding, which will be quite a world to dive into. I didn't realize that metaphor was going to take such a literal meaning in the introduction of this episode, yet here we are. But I'm super excited because Hideo Kojima is someone that I think we all know as a name, as a person, as an ideal, but maybe not as a very critiqued kind of developer and game designer. And I think throughout this entire year, every single title that we're going to look at is actually going to kind of combine our 5 years of experience now doing this podcast.
Yeah, holy moly.
Where we look at not only the aesthetics of the games and like the media that Hideo Kojima himself has referenced and is inspired by, but we're also going to look at the mechanics and the dynamics and all of the interactions of the entire kind of properties. So that's why I am really excited about doing this. But Nicholas, why, or that's more like what we're doing, right?
Yeah.
Nicholas, why are we doing this?
Because I want to. This is the short answer, because I personally want to do this. But
Okay.
also, okay, the more correct and also sort of like the more academic answer is that Kojima's career spans an incredibly large chunk of the history of video games. Modern video games. Obviously, he, wasn't around for like, that early period in like the 60s and 70s, or for like old electronic games and whatnot. However, throughout his entire career, he has always remained not just relevant, but has been considered to be like at the very, very tippy top of the industry. With a lot of really famous, like auteurish game designers, there was a period where they were really important and really influential, and then they kind of fell off. Peter Molyneux is probably a good example of this. Someone who like made some really incredible games, but then he's kind of not really doing much of anything right now. Whereas Kojima just like banger, 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 banger. And even the games that necessarily weren't like as successful as a lot of like, say, the Metal Gear Solid games, even they were all successes. Like he is about as bankable of a creative director as you can possibly get within the games industry, which is really saying something. And to use Kojima then both as like a specific kind of creative director to look at, but then also to use him to try and understand where games were at in various periods, like what were the approaches to design that were common at the times, and just generally speaking, try to understand him within a context rather than as this like isolated unit, like the Kojima.
Yeah. I think for me, what's really fascinating too is that a lot of game designers today struggle with the idea that we are either not going to have jobs, we don't have jobs currently with the waves of layoffs, but also that games at a time right now is a changing landscape. And I think what's going to be really great about this year is that every episode you're going to realize that games has kind of always been a changing landscape. The way the development of games has always been in flux.
Yeah.
And this is kind of one of the there's probably plenty of examples of potentially people you have respected and know as well that don't say have like the name recognition as Hideo Kojima. But regardless of with or without the name recognition, there are other developers that have been in the industry 40 years that are
Yeah.
also in their 60s and started in their 20s, right? Started in the 80s and 90s. And so I think that when we look at this year and we look at these games, while we will be talking about Kojima a lot, it is very important for us to just recognize that we're kind of also talking about, like Nicholas said, the entire history and kind of eras almost of gaming. So era is like a very big chunk of time. It's
Yeah.
in gaming, unfortunately, because of, about every 2 years, right? These kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
technological advancements, storytelling advancements, and inspirations, right, have
Yeah.
come from everywhere. So, with that being said, let's talk about this idyllic Memelord
The
that
creative
is
genius that is.
no. Let us talk about the meme of the man because I think both you and I.
Yeah.
So to start this off, just everybody, Nicholas and I picked up Hideo Kojima's own, you could say, like biography.
It's technically a collection of essays on like various media properties, but they're all written as a kind of like it's like a memoir in vignettes
It
because
is.
most of the time he's actually talking about himself. Like ostensibly he'll be talking about a piece of media, but really he's talking about himself.
And I think that actually is what. So the book is called The Creative Gene. And the kind of pull quote from this book is that a world without books is inconceivable. And like Nicholas said, it is a memoir. Vignettes, if you're not familiar with the term, basically means short story or essay that gives you a slice of someone's life. So if you're familiar with manga or anime, slice of life, yay.
Yeah.
And it really is ostensibly about his interpretations and internalizations of, I think, the
Yeah, that's the
media.
important part, the internalizations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's the internalizations that I think is actually for me what made this book so relatable because I was like, "Oh, I too have seen this movie or I too have read a book like Satori that made me feel the way you feel, even though I have not read that book." So,
Yeah.
I thought
Yeah.
that was really, really interesting. Um, for me at least, like to actually read something and be like, oh, I feel like I can relate to you.
Yeah.
But we'll go deeper into what relatability means versus like admirability. But I just wanted to start with that because I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah. So one of the things that we need to sort of start off with is the kind of like analytical framework that Kojima himself presents for this book. And that is understanding culture as a collection of memes. Now, when I say that, it's very important that for like a contemporary 2025 listener to not actually hear the way in which that word is commonly used. Because nowadays we mostly use memes to like refer to various things that get kind of shared and propagated over and over again on social media. But Kojima is actually using the term meme in an earlier sense, which is actually where the sort of like the lay usage of the term comes from, which is from a book by Richard Dawkins called The Creative Gene, not the creative, The Selfish Gene, which I think the creative gene here is like clearly a takeoff on
Oh, this is a
the
very
selfish
selfish
gene.
book.
Yeah. So without getting too much into Dawkins, because I think we're actually going to talk about it much more extensively when we get to Metal Gear Solid. Basically, so for Dawkins, the gene is like the primary unit of like biological transmission, which is, I mean, that's kind of obvious. That's what genes are. But on in addition to that, he also identifies this thing that he calls a meme, which is the primary unit of cultural transmission. And
Mhm.
so it is the cultural equivalent of the biological gene. And
So
so what, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Lauren.
no, and I was just gonna say, so like when you think about what memes are today, when you see a meme, that is a way of transmitting information and as quickly as possible. And memes are usually funny, but they're also informative, right? They
Yeah.
tell you something about the culture. So I think that my first kind of area of analysis was reading him talk about memes and making contact with the forms of memes to provide knowledge and the wisdom necessary for going out into the real world. I That's his quote, just so we're clear.
Yeah.
Um, I was just honest to goodnight, I was shocked because I was like, this is the literal definition of the word meme. And
Yeah.
I do want for all of our younger listeners and or any listener really that is listening to us today in the year of our Lord 2025 or whatever, um, Kojima is 65 or like so
Yeah.
he is very much like, "Oh, man, I don't understand boom memes." And he goes, "Oh, I get it. It's a way of passing on the information within our hearts and souls." Honestly, this is not actually how I think it is. But if you just put your grandpa, on or your actually, I would be father now for a lot of people. Okay, let's move on because now we're all old in my
Yeah.
generation.
Thanks.
Um,
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for pointing out how old I am. Thank you. I appreciate
but you're not
it.
65.
I have a teenage child. I am one of those. I'm a dad guy. I'm a dad man. I'm a dadder.
You're a dad
I'm a
guy.
I'm a daddy. I
All
am
right,
a dad. I
everyone.
am a daddy
We've
as well.
already
But
we've we've already
okay, yeah. Sorry.
all right, sorry. So to
Let's
keep us
dial.
on track, to keep
Yeah,
us on
dial it back.
track, yeah. Um, I just wanted to say that when I read that, right, as memes are a way of experiencing the world, right, and are there in forth to impart knowledge, it
Yeah,
really is the structure that Kojima has put onto this book is that this is my legacy. Like this is me trying to impart, right, my
yeah,
knowledge upon you. And I think that's real. That
yeah.
was my whole argument.
It's just to get a little bit into sort of like the academic background for this. Essentially, what Dawkins presents in the creative gene is this notion of a meme in like, you know,
The
what in
selfish gene.
anthropology. Yeah, sorry, the selfish gene. God damn it, I'm gonna keep doing that, aren't I? What
Only for
he
this episode. We'll
Yeah,
never.
yeah, yeah, never again, except for the next time I do it. So what he presents is this it's a kind of structuralist argument about memes, about sort of cultural transmission. And so structuralism is not really that prominent in anthropology anymore, and Dawkins' own anthropological bona fides are not exactly great. But sort of to explain how this works, there's a fairly famous essay by Claude Levi-Strauss in which he talks about like the analysis of mythology, and he specifically references the Oedipus myth. And he comes up with this entire system where like you identify the elements of like of a particular myth, and then you essentially put them on index cards, and you index them in exactly the same way that you would index things in, say, like a card catalog for a library. And so that's this idea that you then have a kind of like pseudo database of like the elements of a particular myth, and then with using that database, which for Levi Strauss was a card based system, you can then perform a kind of structural analysis on that thing. And so then memes in this like framing are analogous to like those index cards. They are sort of like the entries within the database that you can search, that you can pull from, and that importantly for Kojima, you can remix for like new forms of creative expression in the same way that like the genes that are inherited from one organism to another, they find a similar expression in the new organism, but they don't have an identical expression in the new organism. And so that is the way Kojima sees his own relationship to the media that he consumes, not as something that he's imitating in a strict sense, but rather sort of like in this combinatorial way, like remixing and reworking.
I think honestly though that is the creative process and pretty much like a nutshell. I
Yeah.
think that a lot of times what has actually really made some people um like really frustrated with the current state of the industry, and what we're what we're trying to avoid is kind of overriding or omitting the human element of the intentionality, right, of creating different properties or different media that you see. And what's really fascinating to me, especially as a director, is that a lot of times it is a lot easier to get your point across when you're like, this is if John Wick met Geralt of Rivia. And people are like, those are two properties I'm familiar with. But
Yeah,
also,
yeah,
like, okay, you know who John Wick is. Very strong character, right?
yeah,
Loves dogs. And you know who Geralt of Rivia is, right? Human, compassionate, a little bit like mutated Witcher, right? And
yeah,
so you already have a picture kind of forming into your brain of this man is probably out for revenge, protecting a daughter or a dog, right? Some sort of childlike thing. And there's like he's gonna be a fighter, like he's gonna fight all the time. Like you kind of
yeah,
get that already from two different references. And I think what's really fascinating is that that's not a character that you're actually creating, right? Maybe your
yeah,
character's name is still John because every character's name's John. And maybe like your setting is going to be the science fiction universe, right, on Mars, and neither Geralt nor John Wick are on Mars. So that's
no,
what I'm saying, right? I think that it's really punchy. And
yeah,
so when you look at the creative process, I think what's really fascinating too is that when he sets up the book like this, assuming you do read the introduction, because it is possible to pick up a book and open it to the first chapter that you come to, and that chapter that I wrote was, or that I read on was, would we be able to go on living in someone else's language? Like,
yeah,
perfect. And you could totally skip his theoretical or his, structural framework.
yeah,
But I think that in reading the introduction, you see that every single kind of essay, even if it's been written out of order, right? Because this book is presented in a way that, right, Kojima and the publisher and his editors put it together, has an introduction, has an afterword.
yeah,
But all of these essays, just so we're clear, are almost in of themselves memes because they
yeah,
were written
yeah,
for a magazine monthly. This is
yeah,
a book of a serialization of Kojima's internalizations
yeah,
about media that he then memes into not only his own creative works, but also
yeah.
into his own life.
Yeah, exactly. And actually that connection to his own life is really important because that's where I think Kojima's particular understanding moves away significantly from the sort of like broader sense of what someone like Dawkins is talking about. Because when Dawkins uses the term meme, he means it in a very generic sense. It's like any aspect of human culture, like anything that is essentially human but not biological. Like that's what he means. Whereas in Kojima's case, it's pretty clear that he means the media that he has consumed in his life and the things that he picks up from those media properties. And Lauren is right. So then the book and his essays are then structured in the same way. They are themselves these meme like units that he is then transmitting to us that we can inherit and use and remix in whatever ways that we see fit, obviously following certain like legal restrictions on what you can and cannot do. But the
Yes.
internalization is interesting because of the fact that like what struck me about reading the book is that it's not just that he understands his like creative output and his own like analytical mind in these terms, but he understands his own biography in this way. Like his biography, as presented here, is a collection of memes, of this kind of meme. And so when he talks about at one point he says that like memes are stories, like memes that stories are memes given form. Sorry, I had that backwards. And that when he's telling a story about his own life, that is sort of like a meme, a unit of like understanding of who he is, that he has then plucked out and then given form in the form of these particular essays and the stories that he constructs around them. And this is important for an analytical framework. Our analytical framework, I guess I should say, is because it means that you'll encounter a lot of contradictory things in what Kojima says about himself. And so I think it's actually really important, and this is a word of caution for like us
Mhm.
specifically, not to like aggrandize what he says too much, because his own interviews are inconsistent concerning his childhood. And given the fact that, like, in his writing, he actually has a history of retconning his own work. A really good example of this is the famous one in Phantom Pain, where basically it completely rewrites the ending of the original Metal Gear. And so, if this is the way he understands how you tell stories, and if he is telling the story of his life in this way, then that means that we, as like critics and as observers from the outside, need to, I guess, keep him at a bit of a remove. And yet, at the
Yeah, and
same
yet
time,
I was gonna say
yeah,
I was gonna say this part because I think at the
okay,
same time, as someone who throughout my own life has had to retell my life story every single time I moved
yeah,
to new people, and as a kid, whether I was 4, I was 7, I was 9, I was 14, it didn't matter like the age. I had to kind of reinvent who I was and my history for the new state that I lived in, for the new town, for the new school system. Another word of caution, right, is that we cannot just use the whole fictional instability of his way of communicating to actually undermine the earnestness that he has. Because
yeah,
I think that for all of the hype and branding that he is building up upon himself,
yeah,
I found his writing. Now, this is translated into English because these essays are originally in Japanese,
yeah,
incredibly earnest.
yeah,
And it was
definitely.
so earnest that I actually questioned it. I was like, Nicholas, is this a translation issue? Because I
No,
don't know if this is what he sounds like in Japanese. And for those of you who don't know, Nicholas speaks pretty much fluent Japanese. Um,
fluent-ish. Yeah, I have.
Fluent-ish.
Yeah,
I mean, thank you for being humble.
yeah.
Incredibly fluent. And he's like, let me just listen to a couple interviews real quick. And then he did. And that's not how he sounds. But then he did. And I think that it was just fascinating because he's like, honestly, Lauren, he's this earnest. He is this blunt. And for
Yeah,
Japanese standards, right? And I think it's really important to remember that as critical, right, as we are going to be on in today's episode, as well as other episodes, for the ideal that your biography and life history can be edited, right? Like
yeah,
that is an ideal I would say he has. We also have to recognize that that doesn't mean that you're being dishonest or that you
yeah.
lack a genuine authenticity for that, right?
So, if you guys want an example of something that had been at least that I found online that had been like translated and has subtitles, there is he did the Criterion Closet, which if you guys are not familiar with that, it's like people go to like the Criterion offices and then they go into this closet where a bunch of like DVDs are, and then they sort of like look through all the DVDs available and talk about their favorites. So he did an episode of this and it's on YouTube. And it's really interesting that he's not just talking about the movies that he picks. He's not just talking about the ones that are like important to him. He's like hyping them at the same time and saying like, you've got to watch this and this is why. And it's almost kind of like an advertisement. And so it can seem not quite genuine in the way that we often read advertisements. But the thing is, there's something that like underlies the way that he talks about things in this hypey way that kind of says that like, okay, yeah, maybe I'm making this up, but by making this up in this particular way, I am trying to communicate something to you that is true. In other words, it may not be factually accurate, but it is true. In other words, the meaning that you derive from it is a thing that I, Kojima in this case, want to communicate to you and I want you to connect with. And that's where I think the earnestness comes from, is because
Yes.
he's not a liar. He just gets things wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's that genuine this is gonna sound terrible now that I'm saying it out loud because in my head it sounded better. The genuine dishonesty sometimes of a communication of a property or a piece of media that you're like, "You have to watch this." So I'm gonna give an example right now so we can understand, right, on podcast, on air, what this means. And that example is everyone really needs to watch The Clone Wars. Okay, the animation is terrible. I totally get that. And this is Star Wars, The Clone Wars, not Star Wars Clone Wars, because there are two animated episodes. One's from
Yeah,
Samurai
the
Jack
one with
Guy.
Ahsoka, not
Yeah, this
the
is the one
yeah,
with Ahsoka. You
yeah.
have to watch the Clone Wars, and you have to watch it because Jar Jar gets it on. And I think everyone needs to understand that the Clone
Okay.
Wars created this fictional world where Jar Jar is like a player. And not only is he a player, he's a general. He ends up like saving the day because he's like mistaken for a Jedi. And like it's a comedy of errors.
Yeah.
Like they really did a Shakespearean telling of Jar Jar being the comedy of errors and being able to go through. So much so that I have compiled a watch list that is just the episodes with Jar Jar in a storytelling order format so that all of my friends can get along with this. Now, I think that what's really interesting is about this kind of example is that really Clone Wars isn't really about Jar Jar, and he really doesn't get it on in any of the episodes, and it's really only hinted at in like a few dialogue lines. So if you
Yeah.
watched this and you watched my watch list, you'd be like, Lauren, this was really lame, and I watched 10 episodes of the 200 episode series of the Clone Wars just for Jar Jar. But it's this point, right? That yeah, I'm kind of in a way I'm overselling it. I am really hyping up the fact that Jar Jar exists in this universe, but I'm also not being dishonest. You're going to see the feelings that I got when I saw Jar Jar recontextualized in this way for the show. Like there was
Yeah.
definitely a fan of Jar Jar there. And
Yeah.
you're going to get it. But you're also going to be like, I don't know if it was worth watching those 2 episodes for just to see it, right? Because
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
like
yeah.
those episodes are actually about how Anakin and Padme were good together. Like,
Oh my God.
I know,
Anakin,
right?
fucking
And
Anakin.
now, yeah, and it's horrible, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, 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 yeah.
it's a layered episode, okay? It's a layered 2-parter, and it all takes place underwater. It's great.
Yeah. Well, they kind
Anyway,
of they kind of have to do that because the Anakin Padme relationship, especially in the second
so
the
this is
second prequel, is so
yeah.
terrible.
So this is not a Star Wars
No,
podcast, but
no,
Star
it's
Wars is
not.
a very known property. Like, just so we're clear, I just did this in my Dungeons and Dragons session, like this past week, and I do think, right, that this is a way of kind of showing and communicating like an ideal, right, to others.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
I haven't actually watched the Criterion interviews, so I should go do that as well. But I
yeah,
did want to just do a really quick as I could make it,
yeah,
example on the podcast for you guys to be like, look, this is an example of you probably just hyping things up to people, and then they
yeah,
watch it and they don't get what you got. And that in of itself, right, is the fictive meme. I am fictionalizing my experience for you to go and watch this media because it's amazing. And then your friends go, yes, that was amazing. I got the same connection you got. Versus your friends are like, yeah, no, Lauren, I will never like Clone Wars, and you should stop making me watch it.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
was
yeah.
like, no, I have made it so easy. And with that, that is my example.
Okay.
Cut.
All right. So I so to like explain the like earnestness. So this is from the Creative Gene. This is on page 240. He says,
Yes.
sometimes, as I continue my creative work, I will be hounded by intense feelings of isolation, put a pin in that because that's very important, or troubled by stress and doubt. In times like those, I am saved by the existence of other people whose mentality is similar to mine. This, of course, includes creative figures like writers, directors, and artists, but could be anyone who tries to connect, quote, me and, quote, me to make new memes. And then it's on the page, it's very clever because me and me, if you put them together, it's memes.
Memes. I actually
Yeah,
read it as
yeah,
memes.
yeah,
I'm not gonna
yeah.
lie. I was like, to make new memes. I was like, well,
But
I
but I
think
think but here's the important part. I think their struggles, in other words, their struggle to sort of like recombine aspects of his own work together, are themselves save me from my loneliness. Their struggles are themselves another story and another meme. In other words, he sees this as a kind of like genetic inheritance. I put this out into the world. People see that. They take aspects of what I have done, they recombine them in ways, and then people read that, and that becomes another inheritance and another inheritance. It's what underlies so much of this is a deep desire for connection. And later on we'll get into sort of like what a terror Kojima is to work with. But as he presents himself, it's like, I am like this. I, Kojima Hideo, am like this because I need to get this out there, because if I don't get this out there, I can't connect with people. I have these profound feelings of loneliness, isolation, like when I was a child. And like that has haunted me ever since. And I know that or he seems to think that he knows that people will interact with him in the same way that he interacted with the media that formed him. And that's where that desperate desire comes from.
I really love that you ended it with it as the desperate desire.
Yeah.
I quite literally had to bite my tongue because this goes into a principle in which I am incredibly fascinated with, and it's genetic memory. And that's all I'm going to say. You can go look up what that is because that will take way too long of our episode to go into it. But I do think that there is something to be said for the inherited experiences and stories that we tell are in our own lives. And I think families is actually a really great way to kind of start with that in terms
Yeah.
of when you were a child. It wasn't just like your parents reading to you, but simple, what I think both Dawkins and kind of Kojima tangentially would call memes were simple things like don't touch fire. That
Yeah.
is an inherited learning experience.
Yeah.
And I still put my hand on the pancake skillet on the stove because I didn't believe it. I had to try it for myself. That
Yeah.
is my desperate desire to say that I must try a thing. I must do a thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think for me, I'm biting my tongue because I think that on the next page, so 240 is the page where he has that paragraph about how the struggles save him from loneliness. And is it in the following page? It's in the afterword, or in this, is that my hope, right? Is that the creative dream will form these connections, strands, if you will, between me
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Okay. We'll talk
you,
about that in a
and
little
maybe
bit.
and maybe new memes will be made. And I have to say that for someone like myself who puts a lot of emphasis in the connections that we make with others, but also in a lot of my work has been about telling stories that showcase and build on those connections and relationships. And quite frankly, it's not just my work. Like if you read or think about like a game that you've really loved, and let's like put Kojima aside for a second, and we just look at say like Persona 5. Like that whole game is right about building connections, like the Persona
Yeah.
series. Final Fantasy, every kind of Final Fantasy game has a strong connection with someone, and either they die or they don't die. They sacrifice themselves for you. You sacrifice for them in a way. Like all of life is somewhat about connections. But man, the use of the word strands just to be like, and did you know I'm making a game about Death Stranding? I
Hint,
was like,
hint.
yes, hint, hint. But it's also a really powerful word in English, but it was also a very powerful word for him to use here. And this is where I go into Kojima knows what he's writing, and
Yeah.
he's very much knows what he wants to communicate. And so, yes, in one way, I would
I would take
say,
issue with that, but go ahead, please.
no, take issue with it as soon as I finish my thought.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that I would say that for this, what we wrote on page two, or sorry, what we read on page 240 and 241 about that loneliness, and we
Yeah.
should kind of get into that because I really do want to talk about that, is that loneliness is kind of the opposite, right, of the connection, right? Do you want to be connected to someone, right, or with people, or loneliness, right? Absence of, you could say, people.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
in this, Kojima not only wants to have that desperate desire to show the connections and strands between the things that he sees in his life that have connected him to himself, also the connections that he's like, now I want to share that connection of myself so that yourself can see the connections between these. And hopefully we'll go read or watch the shows, right, that he brings up. But before I think we move on into the loneliness factor, I have to now go all the way back to the beginning of the book. And this is why I say there is a reason they flipped the essays. And they flipped like the years. Like 2012, I think, is in the front of the book, and the 2008s
Yeah. Yeah.
are
Yeah.
actually part two. And the reason why is because in 2011 of July, uh, in um, in page 64, where is the book called? Is it a book? Hold on, I just want to be super super clear. It is a book called Satori. And he says, and I will begin, and I'm actually going to paraphrase this, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't want to read the whole paragraphs. But he begins by saying, after reading this, my substance is and always has been innately Japanese. And yet the book makes me question and ask myself, but who am I? For whom am I creating? This had brought me to a standstill, unable to move, for in Satori, there is a scene between two pre-thinkers. They are neither East nor West. Nikolai, who was born and raised in Asia, and I don't actually know how to say this, I apologize.
Deland.
Delant,
Yeah.
thank you, who was born and raised in the West, exchange views of the future. They say, we are both forever on the outside, looking in, Nikolai said. So we can either stand on the periphery of their world, always looking in, or we can stand in ours and create our own. He's right. I'm not Western. I'm not Eastern. I'm not Japanese. I'm Hideo Kojima.
Hideo
Because
Kojima.
because the games I make are played across national and cultural boundaries. I am called Sekai no Kojima, meaning Kojima of the world. There's no need to let myself be so confounded by nicknames. The only thing I need to do is create a world of my own making, the world of Hideo Kojima. And I was like, man, damn it, that's so freaking inspirational. But it's also just like, who are like you are reinventing yourself at the
Yeah,
beginning. So page, that's what I'm saying. Like this, if
yeah.
you read this book front to back,
Well,
cover to
he's
cover,
okay. I want to put a point on this. He's retconning himself, is what he's doing. Not just reinventing, he's retconning himself.
retcon.
Because there was existing Kojima lore prior to these like statements that he's made, and then he's like, "Fuck the fans! I'm going to retcon my own lore," which I mean,
Which is
I,
so
I which I
powerful.
think is also fine. Like from a personal perspective, like as you age, as you come to a different understanding of your life, like you should be able to say like, I understand these things differently now. I am a different person. I've evolved over time. I am not always the same. I am not a clone of myself. And I said that pointedly. But I want to go back to the God, there was something I
No,
was going to take issue with you in what you said. Now I don't remember
I
what it
know.
was.
I'm sorry.
It's fine. It's not a big deal.
You will get there. I'm sure you'll find something issue with something else I say again. It's gonna happen.
Yeah, it often happens.
And I just yeah, and I just have to say this because like I think it's crazy to me that I have an example. I say crazy in a absurd or disbelieving way, is that I have a positive example, and perhaps
Yeah,
it is because his career spans 4 decades, right?
yeah.
That
I now remember what it was I wanted to say. So
perfect. That I have a semi-positive example of someone whose career spans 4 decades, who my co-host just said has lore about them,
he
right?
does. He really does.
And And it's just so fascinating to then read something like this, and it's like, I am taking the narrative back. And that's what I'm talking about when I say why, like, that is why it felt inspirational to me. And also why it can feel, once again, like coming back down from, man, I was super fucking inspired reading that. But
Yeah,
also, let's be like, just to cut myself, like, undercut my own argument is what I'm trying to say, I guess. Caution my own argument.
yeah.
Um, just to very clearly go like, yes, it's I'm taking back my own narrative. That is a very powerful message. But also there is still existing narrative. Like
Yeah.
there is still a reality that exists. That's all I'm trying to say. So what did you take issue with?
So you had said previously that Kojima always knows what he's saying. Always, or actually, I think your words were he always knows what he wants to say. And I don't think that's
In this
incorrect. I would
okay.
say, but he's not always aware of what he's actually saying.
Yes. Okay. I
And
like
so,
that. I like
and
that.
so
He
there was
always
this,
knows what he wants to say, but he's not
yeah,
aware that of what he is saying.
because the thing is, especially if you look at his creative work, it's like at times it can feel like everything is text, like everything is explicit. A lot of the like goofy campiness of the characters derives from the fact that like they say exactly what they think and they're trying to be as explicit as possible, blah blah, about what type of character they are. But because of that, I so the way I was describing this to my partner was that Kojima at times always seems really self-aware while at the same time not being very introspective. In other words, he often doesn't really get into the way he feels about certain things that happen in his life. He doesn't necessarily probe their significance because in treating them as like these like mythic is treating the events of his life as these sort of like mythic archetypes, these mythological units that he is then going to remix for like whatever purpose he happens to have in mind at the time. He doesn't really delve into sort of like the fundamental ambivalence that is often coming across in those things. And a good example of this, to my mind, going back to sort of like the question of his isolation, is that in the chapter on Blade Runner, when he's sort of like giving a brief overview of the film, he describes it as, you know, being a type of neo-noir, which it is. Ridley Scott has said this himself. But he says, unlike noir, there isn't a profound sense of isolation and loneliness that pervades the film. And I was like, are you kidding me? Did we watch the same film? Like, if anything, Blade Runner actually takes that aspect of noir to its extreme. Like Decker is a fundamentally isolated character. Like he actually, like, part of the whole point of the film is that people, both like cyborgs, both androids and humans, have this in like terrible difficulty connecting with their own humanity. They are these like isolated little worker bee units, and they don't really know what to do with that. So when Kojima looks at that world, he sees a world that he's like, I desperately want to live there. It's so cool, it's so awesome. And I think part of the reason for that is because when talking about his own loneliness from his childhood and this sort of like mythic story that he tells over and over again about being a latchkey kid, that he, because he hasn't actually he hasn't really gone through dealing with like the psychological depth of that loneliness and its fundamental ambivalence for him, that he then looks at a film like Blade Runner and he sees the way loneliness is presented in that film, and then he sees himself in Decker and is like, yeah, that's awesome, in the same way I am awesome. Because for him, loneliness isn't just a source of anxiety and frustration. Loneliness is also sort of this like precursor. It's like the firmament upon which creativity blossoms. Like it is the primary condition that you need, at least in Kojima's case, in order for like this kind of like remixing way of doing things to emerge. And
Yeah.
I think that's very different from, like, say, the way I experience loneliness. Just putting that out there.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say is like, I think that, so I actually want you to finish your thought on how you experience loneliness before I
Yeah.
respond to the Blade Runner thing, because I do now want everyone to remember that this is an introduction episode to the entire year of Metal Gear, and then also with Death Stranding. And
Yeah.
so when we kind of look at this, I know we're getting to kind of the latter third of our episode. We are going to now introduce more of kind of the main kind of concepts of Metal Gear, which is a lot about like father, son, the female relationship, like in there, relationships being not necessarily like a friendship word is what I'm trying to say, but it's not that either. The way females are portrayed, the way men and older men to younger
Yeah.
men are portrayed, right? And that is really kind of all comes down to a sort of, you could say, family dynamic. But before we move into that, to just really kind of hone in on how loneliness is important for both Kojima's kind of history and the
Yeah.
creative journey, I do want you to mention how you experience loneliness for just like 30 seconds. Because for me, when I read it, I didn't quite get the same reading from that chapter that you did. And so I
Okay.
just want
No,
to provide a
that's
different
good.
perspective.
No, but I think that's actually kind of the important point, is that, like, because of the fact that Kojima is often presenting things like as text, like everything is text, everything is like at the surface, that like it kind of doesn't deal well with the fact that like you have a different reading of this, I have a different reading of
Yeah.
this, Kojima has a different reading of this, and that all of those things exist simultaneously with the same text. And so when it comes to sort of like, Kojima talks a lot about sort of the significance of the death of his father, and again, in very sort of like everything is text kind of terms. And as someone whose father recently passed away and that it had a profound effect on me in very ambivalent ways, like there's something like the way he talked about his father and like the loneliness that he experienced as a result of then sort of like being put in this position where he kind of had to like look after himself, it felt really shallow to me. And I don't necessarily think it is. I think Kojima probably has really complex feelings about, his father and
Hmm.
mother, but they're not here. They're not in this
Yeah.
book.
And I
Eh,
think that's
yeah.
where I was going to kind of come in and say that with my own experience of loneliness in the creative journey, reading this chapter on Blade Runner has been, or I guess it didn't really impact me as much because I feel like I understood what he meant when he said that the neo noirness of Blade Runner had an absence of loneliness. In that, in typical noir films, the loneliness is of the protagonist physically being on set because they can't afford extras alone, right? There's
Yeah.
this sense of like depravity or decadence or simultaneously in isolation from the world you need to exist in, which is the notion of like the femme fatale and the criminals, right? But additionally, because you have to be a part of that world, you are isolated and alone from, right, the world of good society. right?
Yeah.
So Noir is the man on the edge, right? The border between, well, I have, the mobs on one side, the gangs on one, and I have to exist in that world. But being in that world prevents me from being fully in the other world. But because I also am on the side of law and order and justice, I simultaneously am not in that world.
Yeah.
And I think what was fascinating about Blade Runner as a principle, right, as a movie, is remember, right, Deckard thinks he is a part of one world, and yet is somehow
Yeah.
in fact a part of the second, which is why once again Ridley Scott's like, no, I
huge
was
fucking
really.
spoilers for that film.
Oh, if you haven't seen Blade Runner right now,
Yeah.
hey, huge fucking spoilers for if you've seen it, you know what he's saying. If you haven't seen it, you have no idea what
Yeah, I
Ridley's
suppose it's
gonna
true.
say.
That doesn't make any sense to you if you don't
That
know
doesn't
that.
make any sense to you. So,
Yeah.
and I think, sorry, versus Blade Runner, because if its production budget was through the roof, mainly also because they did hire a bunch of actors to make the world feel like there was a lot of life. That I think when Kojima watched it, he was like, wow, I can sense that Deckard is a part of this world in a way that other noir protagonists aren't explicitly from the start of a movie, right? Told that
Yeah.
they are
Okay.
isolated and alone. And only after does he realize where his isolation actually came from? Does he then also then find his connection? So it totally makes sense why, and that's the read I took from this chapter, because this is the chapter that comes right after another chapter about how Kojima portrays women. Where I
setting that aside for a second.
setting that aside for a second,
Yeah.
where I actually was like, simultaneously, I can have admiration, inspiration, and respect from someone while simultaneously recognizing that there is an amount of unignorable disrespect that I am unable to put aside while I read this.
Yeah.
And yet, Blade Runner was one of the films that I grew up on because my dad was very into it. Like, he was kind of part of that kind of cult film movement.
Yeah.
And so for me, when I saw it, I really did feel like it was a movie that makes you want to look up into the sky. It makes you want to kind of feel the rain on your face, because it is a movie that profoundly makes you feel like, if I could only be a part of a world in which my loneliness is almost accepted as that world, but also is necessary in order to do my job. And yet I am a writer. And lately I have felt like, as a writer, you also must isolate yourself in order to actually get your writing done. Because if you're talking to people all day, you're not writing.
Yeah.
And so I see that kind of parallelism and that creativity from the chapter, that I think that for me, it was about how I could see how he sees so much of himself in Deckard, and that he was like, wow, at the end of it all, you're still alone. And yet there's a joy in that loneliness when looked
Yeah.
through the creative lens.
Yeah.
Right. So,
and I guess what's frustrating is that I, as being the kind of person that I am, I would want someone writing an essay to actually try to like probe that loneliness and think about it a little bit more extensively. But I think your read is more correct than I initially gave it credit for, because especially when he describes like visiting bookstores, because he does this several times in various essays, because he loves going to bookstores both to buy books but then also to just kind of be in them. And one of the things that he says is that like by going up and down the aisles, looking at what titles have become available and just like seeing the sorts of things that have been put out in the world, he says, I get a sense of like how the world is transforming, like how it's changing, like what people are thinking about now. And so, but it's that sort of like loneliness connection dyad again, where it's like he's not doing this as a social activity. He's not with anybody. He's not really interacting with anybody. But at the same time, it is a way for him to connect to the things that other people have put out into the world, and then get the kind of connection to them that he is used to having basically with regards to any media that he consumes. Like, that is his inroad. Maybe, I don't know Kojima personally, but he actually, in a lot of the documentaries, he seems like a perfectly sociable guy. But it's clear that he sees himself in this way, even if maybe he actually isn't. And to sort of like there is one, if you have anything else to say on that point, I have one more quote that I want to draw our
I
attention
have
to.
nothing else to say. I do have lots to say on that point, but I have nothing else to say for this podcast on it, so that we can present the family dynamic and the quotes in which that we must present for an intro.
Okay. So this is on page 154. I'm going to read pretty extensively here because I think this is really important. This is Kojima describing himself as a latchkey kid.
Yeah. And so this once again, right, connects to that sense of loneliness and connection. And sometimes
Yeah.
that the only way to find connection to the world is also to isolate yourself from it.
So this is the one instance in which I thought that he actually was trying to probe it. On the previous page ends by saying, "One day this loneliness may kill me." And so I tended to keep to myself. Some part of me found peace in isolation. At the same time, society just didn't deal with issues of human psychology. And I think he has an accurate picture of Japan here. Mental health services in Japan have a fraud history. Mental health treatments for things like PTSD and manic depression weren't commonly acknowledged. Even if I had gone to someone for help, they would have dealt with it through classic literature and not clinical psychology. So I was never able to talk to anyone about my chronic loneliness. When did it start? Just what caused me to be this way? I can't think of any absolute reason. My father's sudden death when I was in junior high might have been a factor, but I keep coming back to how I was a latchkey kid from a young age. It was the 1970s, a time of rapid economic growth, and both my parents worked. I think this is the money quote right here. I kept my house key dangling from a piece of yarn around my neck like a dog tag. It was annoying whenever I did a somersault on the horizontal bar, but I still wore that key 24/7. The connection that he has to his family home is a dog tag. It's the thing that identifies him as like the soldier who's been left behind in a certain instance. And the thing is, like, when you look at the sort of media that he and we'll talk about this in the Patreon episode, when you look at the sort of media that he initially gravitates to when he's working on the Metal Gear series, he's very much enamored with these action heroes who have been, in a sense, kind of been left out to dry. And that is a common theme for Snake throughout the entire series. Snake is this guy who is like an operator. He's like the best at what he does, but also at the same time abandoned. Like, that's, to me, that's a really profound statement. And so I don't want to say that Kojima never gets into sort of like
Yeah.
his emotions about these things, but that it's these rare moments that you really have to sort of like key in on.
I think that the rare moments to key in on speak louder for me personally as the reason why potentially Kojima, when he does do interviews, comes across as very sociable and more personable. In that, also, he himself admits that in order to make everyone think that everything's okay, also made himself more cheerful on the exterior. Once again, I don't know if this is true. I don't know the man personally. And
Yeah.
after 40 years of writing about yourself, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure
Yeah.
at one point he did do this, especially in college as a young adult, right? Like, none of your friends want to hear about your sad life. Like,
Yeah.
I was that kid. I understand. I was like, oh, I could tell you about what's going on at home. Or did you hear this movie came out? Let's all go sit quietly in a theater.
Yeah.
Instead and not talk about our feelings. Like 10 out of 10 response for an adolescent man. Okay. And I was not an adolescent man. But even adolescent Lauren. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that we have to remember that it's also really hard, right? When you have your own lore, right, on the internet, I think to also then talk about what happens to you in ways that also then don't seem, once again, like that fictiveness, right, of your reality. So that money quote, as you call it, like that almost kind of mirror to Snake himself, right? I think makes it even more kind of impactful for Kojima's kind of like narrative for himself. And that he is like, to be completely honest with you, because I am a creator, and sometimes when you're creating and you're writing, you're like, this character, blah, 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 blah. It
Yeah.
really isn't until you get to the end of their story that like you read it back to yourself and then you're like, I'm making like different facial expressions, right? And I don't know how to
Yeah,
do
she
that
is.
verbally.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's more like, oh, mm, uh, actually, maybe, oh, is that me? Right? And it can be any gender, just so we're clear, right? Because I've written
Yeah.
male characters, I've written female characters, I've written non-binary characters, trans, like you name it, right? Gender, be damned. You write a character, and suddenly you're like, you know, I think that character's sense of sardonic, dry humor is actually me. And I definitely can see myself saying that, but I didn't think about it in the context until I stepped back, right, and looked at it holistically. And I'm sure there are moments, I think, in everyone's life, right, where you've done that. I think what makes this more poignant is that this entire year is going to be about Metal Gear and Metal Gear Solid, specifically on the character Snake. So it's been really interesting for me to kind of like go through this book. And then also, I watched the movie that you said we were supposed to watch, just FYI.
Yeah,
And
we'll
then
talk
I
about
was
that in the
like,
Patreon episode.
okay, and we'll talk about that in the Patreon episode. So I think my only ending statement here is that talking about how the loneliness that I think Kojima felt as a child is probably something that he carried into himself as an adulthood, which probably is what also made him kind of like a creator. So for him, I think he looks at it as a sense of, I cannot change my past, but I must reinvent it or retcon it in a way so that the terrible isolation, loneliness, and negativity I felt is now actually positive, because if I had not had that experience, I could not be the Kojima that I am today. And I think that is my ending thought to the creative gene.
Shit. Lauren, can we pause the recording?
Yeah, what's up?
The cat is.
What? This again? Oh my.
It's over. It's all over.
Yeah, spooky voice on the radio. The episode is over.
No! You failed.